The first time my father heard my code name, he laughed so hard he nearly choked on his coffee. We were sitting in his cramped kitchen in Queens, the same one where he'd grilled me about my grades, my friends, and eventually my career choices for the past 28 years of my life. The morning sun filtered through yellowed curtains, casting everything in that familiar sepia tone that made our conversations feel like old photographs. The translator. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, still chuckling. Jesus, Danny, they couldn't come up with something cooler. What's next? Are they gonna call you the librarian? The accountant? I stirred my coffee slowly, watching the cream swirl into patterns that reminded me of satellite imagery. It's just a designation, Dad. Nothing dramatic. Nothing dramatic, he says. He leaned back in his chair, the same wooden chair that had creaked under his weight for as long as I could remember. My son works for the government doing God knows what, and they call him the translator. You know what I told the guys at work? I told them my boy speaks languages for Uncle Sam. Real exciting stuff. The sarcasm in his voice cut deeper than it should have. Frank Riley had spent 35 years working construction, building the concrete foundations that held up half of New York City. His hands were permanently stained with dirt and cement dust, his back curved from decades of hunching over blueprints and rebuy. In his world, you measured a man's worth by what he could build, what he could fix, what he could point to at the end of the day and say, I made that. What could I point to? Conversations in languages he'd never heard of, with people whose names I couldn't speak, in places that didn't exist on any map he'd ever seen. Language is important, Dad, I said, keeping my voice level. Communication is everything in international relations. International relations. He said it like it tasted bad. You know what international relations were when I was your age. You shook hands with the guy from the next neighborhood over and hoped he didn't try to rob you. I'd heard variations of this speech before. Frank Riley's world was measured in city blocks, in union meetings, in the satisfied exhaustion that came from physical labor. My world was measured in encrypted frequencies, in the subtle differences between dialects, in the kind of exhaustion that came from holding secrets that could reshape continents. I'm proud of what I do, I said, though I wasn't sure why I felt the need to defend myself. I'm sure you are. He stood up, joint audibly popping, and moved to the sink. The translator. Christ. When I was in Nam, we had code names that meant something. Hammer. Steel. Ghost. Names that made you think twice about messing with a guy. Vietnam. Always came back to Vietnam with him. He'd done 2 tours as a combat engineer, building bridges and clearing mines, work that had earned him a Purple Heart and a permanent limp. Real work, as he called it. Work that mattered. Times change, Dad. Yeah, they do. He turned on the faucet, steam rising from the hot water. And apparently they change in ways that make grown men afraid to give themselves proper warrior names. I wanted to tell him that there were different kinds of wars now, that the battlefield wasn't always a jungle or a desert, but sometimes a conference room in Geneva or a cafe in Prague, that the most dangerous weapons weren't always guns and bombs, but words spoken in the right accent to the right person at precisely the right moment. But I couldn't tell him any of that. So instead, I finished my coffee and listened to him talk about the new apartment complex his crew was working on, about how the architects these days didn't understand structural integrity, about how everything was built cheap and fast and wouldn't last. Just like code names, apparently. That conversation happened on a Tuesday. By Thursday, everything had changed. I was in my apartment in Arlington, a sterile 1-bedroom that came furnished with government-approved furniture and walls thin enough that I could hear my neighbor's television. It was 11 p.m., and I was reviewing files for a meeting the next day with a cultural attaché from a country that had recently discovered some very interesting mineral deposits. The knock on my door wasn't urgent, but it was official. 3 deliberate raps, exactly the kind of knock you'd expect from someone who'd been trained to announce their presence without appearing threatening. I looked through the peephole and saw a woman in a navy dress uniform, her cap tucked under her arm, her expression serious but not grim. I'd never seen her before, but everything about her bearing screamed high rank and official business. "Daniel Riley?" she asked when I opened the door. "Yes, Admiral Sarah Chen, Naval Intelligence. May I come in?" I stepped aside, suddenly aware of how sparse my apartment looked, how temporary everything felt. Admiral Chen moved with the kind of confidence that came from having submarines and aircraft carriers at your disposal, but her eyes were kind, almost grandmotherly behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Mr. Riley, I need to ask you about your father." The words hit me like cold water. "My father? Is everything okay?" "He's fine," she said quickly. "But I understand he's been asking questions about your work. About your code name specifically." I felt my stomach drop. "Admiral, I haven't told him anything classified. I would never." She held up a hand. "I'm not here because you've done anything wrong. I'm here because we need to have a conversation about what your father thinks he knows and what he's about to learn." "I don't understand." Admiral Chen walked to my living room window, looking out at the lights of Washington, D.C. in the distance. "Mr. Riley, how much do you know about your father's service record? Vietnam, combat engineer, 2 tours, Purple Heart." I rattled off the facts I'd grown up with, the safe details that had shaped my understanding of who Frank Riley was. "That's all accurate," she said, "but it's not complete." She turned back to me, and suddenly I understood that this wasn't a routine security check. This was something bigger. "Your father has a security clearance, Mr. Riley. Has had one for 43 years. The words didn't make sense. "That's impossible. He's a construction worker. He builds things, yes, but not the kind of things you think." Admiral Chen reached into her briefcase and pulled out a tablet. "Frank Riley, Senior Chief Petty Officer, retired. Naval Construction Battalion 7, Special Projects Division." She handed me the tablet, and I found myself looking at military records I'd never seen before. Photos of my father in uniform, but not the army fatigues I'd expected. Navy dress whites, commendations I'd never heard of, assignments to places with code names instead of real locations. "The CBs," I whispered. "Not just any CBs," Admiral Chen said. "Your father was part of a classified unit that built infrastructure for operations that officially never happened. Airstrips in countries we weren't supposed to be in. Communication arrays that couldn't appear on any budget. Underground facilities that needed to be invisible to satellite surveillance." I scrolled through the records, trying to reconcile this information with the man who'd mocked my code name 3 days earlier. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because tomorrow morning, your father is going to receive a visit from someone who will ask him to come out of retirement." "What?" Admiral Chen sat down across from me, her expression serious. "Mr. Riley, are you familiar with the situation in the South China Sea?" "Generally." I was being careful, not sure what level of classification we were operating under. "There's a situation developing that requires a very specific skill set. The kind of skill set that involves building something that can't be built, in a place where it can't exist, for a purpose that can't be acknowledged." She gestured to the tablet. "Your father built 3 similar installations during his active duty. All of them are still operational 30 years later. All of them are still classified above top secret." I was beginning to understand, but the implications were staggering. "You want him to build something. We need him to build something. And we need you to help us convince him to do it." "Me?" Admiral Chen leaned forward. "Mr. Riley, your code name isn't random. The translator doesn't refer to your language skills, though those are considerable. It refers to your ability to bridge different worlds, to take complex concepts and make them accessible, to find common ground between people who speak different languages, literally and figuratively." The room felt smaller suddenly, as if the walls were closing in. "I still don't understand what this has to do with my father. Frank Riley is the best at what he does, but he's been out of the game for 15 years, and the kind of project we need him for, it's not something we can order him to do. It's something we need to convince him to volunteer for. She stood up, smoothing down her uniform. And you, Mr. Riley, are the only person he trusts enough to listen to when it comes to matters of national security. That's not true. He thinks what I do is boring office work. No, Admiral Chen said quietly. He doesn't. The tablet slipped from my hands as the full weight of her words hit me. He knows. He's always known. Frank Riley has been read into every operation you've worked on for the past 5 years. Every diplomatic crisis you've helped resolve, every international incident you've helped prevent, every negotiation you've facilitated that kept American interests secure. I felt like I was falling, even though I was sitting down. That's impossible. He would have said something. Would he? Frank Riley spent 43 years keeping classified information classified. You think he'd break that pattern just to tell his son he was proud of him? The room was silent except for the hum of my refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic. I thought about every conversation we'd had about my work, every dismissive comment about my desk job, every time he'd made me feel like what I did didn't matter. He was protecting me, I said finally. He was protecting the operation, Admiral Chen corrected. Just like you've been protecting it by not telling him what you really do. You both learned to compartmentalize, to keep the people you love separate from the work that could get them killed. She moved toward the door, then paused. Mr. Riley, your father is going to be asked to do something that's arguably impossible. It's going to be dangerous. It's going to require him to leave the life he's built, and it's going to put him in a position where one mistake could have international consequences. And you want me to convince him to do it. I want you to translate for him, she said. Help him understand what's at stake. Help him see that the skills he's spent decades perfecting aren't obsolete. They are exactly what we need right now. After she left, I sat in my apartment for hours, trying to process what I'd learned. My father, the man who'd spent my entire life complaining about architects and city planners and anyone who built things without understanding how they worked, had been one of the Navy's premier construction specialists. The man who'd mocked my code name had been living under an assumed identity for 15 years. And somehow, without either of us knowing it, we'd both ended up doing the same job, building bridges between worlds that weren't supposed to connect. The next morning, I drove to Queens with a head full of questions and a folder full of classified documents that Admiral Chen had cleared me to review. The situation in the South China Sea was more complex than I'd realized, involving territorial disputes, mineral rights, and the kind of strategic positioning that could determine the balance of power in the Pacific for the next 50 years. And apparently, it all hinged on building something that couldn't be built. I found my father in his garage, bent over the engine of his 1987 Chevy pickup. The truck was older than some of my colleagues, but Frank maintained it with the same precision he brought to everything else. Every tool in its place, every part labeled and catalogued, every procedure followed exactly. Danny. He looked up, surprised. You're early. Coffee's not even ready yet. That's okay, Dad. We need to talk. Something in my tone made him straighten up, made him really look at me for the first time in months. Everything all right? I met with Admiral Chen last night. The wrench in his hand went completely still. For a moment, the only sound was the drip of oil from the truck's drain pan. Admiral Chen, he repeated carefully. She told me about your real service record. Frank set the wrench down with deliberate precision, wiped his hands on a rag that had seen better decades, and walked to his workbench. He leaned against it, suddenly looking every one of his 68 years. How much did she tell you? Enough. I pulled out the tablet Admiral Chen had left with me. Dad, why didn't you ever say anything? He was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands. You know what the hardest part of classified work is, Danny? It's not keeping secrets from strangers. It's keeping them from the people who matter most. But I have clearance. I could have. Could have what? Been proud of your old man. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Son, you think I didn't know what you really do? You think I don't read the briefings that come across my desk every month with your operational code name on them? The garage felt smaller than my apartment had the night before. You've been getting briefings. Every operation. Every success. Every time you've helped prevent something that would have cost American lives. He looked up at me, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before, pride mixed with regret. You want to know why I made fun of your code name? I nodded. Because the translator is the most dangerous designation in the intelligence community. It means you're the guy they send when there's no other option. When diplomacy has failed and war isn't acceptable, they send the translator. Frank walked over to a filing cabinet in the corner of the garage, one I'd always assumed held tax returns and insurance papers. He pulled out a key from his pocket and opened the bottom drawer, revealing files and binders that definitely didn't contain household documents. I've been following your career for 5 years, he said, pulling out a thick folder. Every time you've walked into a room full of people who wanted to kill each other and somehow convinced them to sit down and talk instead. Every time you've prevented an international incident that could have started a war. He handed me the folder, and I found myself looking at copies of after-action reports I'd written, commendations I'd never seen, and intelligence assessments that described my work in terms I barely recognized. Subject demonstrates exceptional ability to identify common ground between hostile parties, Frank read from one of the reports. Capable of establishing trust in high-stress environments where previous diplomatic efforts have failed. Recommended for operations requiring delicate cultural navigation and crisis de-escalation. I flipped through page after page of documentation, seeing my career through the eyes of people I'd never met, people who'd been analyzing my work and measuring its impact on global stability. Dad, I had no idea you. I made fun of your code name because I was scared, he said quietly. Every time I got one of those briefings, every time I read about another situation you'd walked into, I was terrified that the next folder would contain a casualty report with your name on it. He sat down on a rolling stool, suddenly looking older than his years. You know what they called me? Stonewall. Because once I built something, it was never coming down. But Danny, what you build, it's more important than anything I ever constructed. What do you mean? I built facilities. Physical infrastructure. Things that served a purpose for a while and then got abandoned or demolished when the geopolitical situation changed. He gestured to the folder in my hands. You build peace. You build understanding between people who've been enemies for generations. You build solutions that last. We stood there in the garage, surrounded by the tools and equipment that had defined his life, finally talking about the work that had defined both of ours. Admiral Chen said they need you for something, I said. Yeah. He nodded slowly. They need someone to build something impossible in a place where it can't exist. Will you do it? Frank was quiet for a moment, looking around the garage that had been his refuge for 15 years. Danny, do you know what the South China Sea situation is really about? Territorial disputes, mineral rights, strategic positioning. It's about the future, he said. There are rare earth deposits under those waters that could determine who controls advanced technology for the next century. Whoever has access to those minerals controls everything from satellite communications to renewable energy systems. He pulled out another file, this one marked with classification levels I'd never seen before. China's building artificial islands to claim territorial waters. The US can't respond with military force without risking a war that could go nuclear. But if someone could build a research station in international waters, something that appeared to be civilian but could monitor Chinese activities and protect shipping lanes. That's what they want you to build. That's what they need me to build. A facility that looks like a marine biology research station but functions as an intelligence-gathering platform. Something that can withstand typhoons, operate independently for months at a time, and house equipment that officially doesn't exist. The scope of it was staggering. How is that even possible? Frank smiled for the first time since I'd arrived. The same way we built listening posts in the Arctic during the Cold War. The same way we constructed radar stations in the Sahara without anyone noticing. You build it in pieces, you transport it separately, and you assemble it in conditions that would kill most people. And if you get caught, then a lot of people pretend they never heard of Frank Riley. I thought about Admiral Chen's words about translation and bridging worlds. What do you need from me? I need you to help me understand something, he said. I know how to build things that can't be built. But this project, it's not just about construction. It's about creating something that serves multiple purposes simultaneously. A facility that functions as genuine scientific research while gathering intelligence, that maintains international legal status while serving American interests. He pulled out blueprints that looked like they'd been designed by someone with an advanced degree in both engineering and international law. I need the translator, he said quietly. I need someone who can help me navigate not just the technical challenges, but the political and cultural ones. Someone who understands how to make something appear innocent while serving a much larger purpose. For the first time since Admiral Chen's visit, I understood what was really being asked of both of us. This wasn't just a construction project. It was a diplomatic mission disguised as an engineering challenge. Dad, if we do this together, we build something that could prevent a war, he said. Or start one, if we get it wrong. I thought about every operation I'd been part of, every negotiation where the wrong word could have meant the difference between peace and conflict. This felt bigger than all of them combined. When do we start? Frank's smile was the first genuine one I'd seen from him in years. Well, first we need to figure out how to build a marine research station that can survive Category 5 typhoons while housing surveillance equipment that doesn't officially exist. You know any good translators? Over the next 6 weeks, I learned more about my father than I had in the previous 28 years. We spent our days in a secure facility outside Baltimore, working with teams of engineers, intelligence analysts, and marine biologists who were all pretending they weren't building something that could shift the balance of power in the Pacific. Frank approached the project with the same methodical precision he brought to everything else, but I watched him come alive in ways I'd never seen. This wasn't just construction, this was creation. He was designing systems within systems, building redundancies and backup plans that accounted for everything from equipment failure to international inspection. My role was more complex than I'd expected. I wasn't just translating between languages. I was translating between disciplines, between military and civilian perspectives, between the practical requirements of construction and the legal complexities of international waters. The research lab needs to be fully functional, I explained during one planning session. If anyone inspects this facility, they need to find legitimate scientific equipment doing legitimate research. But the real equipment needs to be completely hidden, added Dr. Sarah Kim, our lead intelligence systems designer. Detection would mean international incident. Frank studied the blueprints spread across the conference table. So we're building 2 facilities in the same space. One visible, one invisible. Exactly, I said. And they both need to work perfectly. Like a translation, Frank said slowly. Same meaning, different languages. Same function, different appearances. I agreed. We worked 16-hour days, solving problems that had never been solved before. How do you hide surveillance equipment inside marine biology lab equipment? How do you build a facility that can be assembled by a civilian construction crew who don't know they are building an intelligence platform? How do you create something that serves 2 completely different purposes without compromising either one? The answers came slowly, through hundreds of small innovations and countless revisions. Frank designed modular construction systems that could be assembled in multiple configurations. I developed operational protocols that would allow genuine marine biologists to work alongside intelligence personnel without either group knowing about the other. It's like building a theater set, Frank explained to me one evening as we reviewed the final plans. From the audience, it looks like a real room, but from backstage, you can see all the supports and mechanisms that make it work. Except in this case, some of the audience might be trying to figure out how the magic trick works, I said. Then we better make sure it's a really good trick. The construction phase took place in 3 different countries simultaneously. The basic structure was fabricated in South Korea, the specialized equipment was assembled in Japan, and the integration systems were prepared in the Philippines. Each component was designed to appear completely innocent on its own, just another piece of marine research infrastructure being shipped to just another scientific installation. I spent most of this phase traveling between sites, coordinating with local officials, managing the complex logistics of international shipping, and making sure that every aspect of the project maintained its civilian cover story. This was the kind of work I'd been trained for, building relationships, establishing trust, navigating cultural and bureaucratic complexities that could derail the entire operation. But it was also the most challenging translation work I'd ever done. I wasn't just converting words between languages, I was converting intent between contexts. Every conversation with a shipping official, every meeting with a port authority representative, every discussion with a customs inspector required me to present the truth in a way that revealed nothing. Frank, meanwhile, was solving problems that shouldn't have been solvable. How do you install a satellite communication array that looks like a weather monitoring station? How do you build underwater sensor networks that appear to be marine life monitoring systems? How do you create living spaces that can house twice as many people as they appear to accommodate? The secret, he told me during one of our weekly video conferences, is to remember that form follows function, but sometimes function follows form. If you need something to look like a marine biology lab, you start by building the best marine biology lab you can. Then you figure out how to hide what you really need inside that framework. Translation again, I said. Everything's translation when you're building something that needs to be 2 things at once. The assembly phase was scheduled to take place over a period of 6 weeks, during the region's dry season when typhoon activity was minimal. The site was a carefully chosen location in international waters, far enough from any national boundary to avoid territorial disputes, but close enough to the areas of interest to fulfill its intelligence-gathering mission. I arrived at the site aboard a research vessel that looked exactly like what it claimed to be, a floating base for marine biology research. The ship was equipped with laboratories, diving equipment, specimen storage, and all the other infrastructure you'd expect for a legitimate scientific expedition. It was also equipped with communication systems that could reach satellites I'd never heard of, computing equipment that could process intelligence data in real time, and storage systems for equipment that officially didn't exist. Frank had been on site for 2 weeks already, overseeing the initial construction phases and working with a crew that had been carefully selected for their skills and their security clearances. Watching him work was like watching an artist. Every decision was deliberate, every system was designed to serve multiple purposes, and every component fit together with the kind of precision that came from decades of experience. "How's it looking?" I asked him during my first night on site. "Complicated," he said, but he was smiling. "Good complicated, though. The kind of complicated that means we're solving problems that matter." Over the next month, I watched something impossible take shape. The Marine Research Station looked exactly like what it claimed to be, a state-of-the-art facility for studying ocean ecosystems and climate change. The laboratories were equipped with the most advanced equipment available. The living quarters were comfortable and functional, and the support systems could sustain a research team for months at a time. But underneath that visible infrastructure was something else entirely. Communication arrays that could intercept and analyze electronic signals across hundreds of miles. Sensor networks that could track submarine movements and surface vessel traffic. Computing systems that could process intelligence data and transmit it securely to facilities that didn't appear on any map. The real beauty of it, Frank explained to me as we stood on the station's main deck, watching the sunset paint the South China Sea in shades of gold and red, is that both functions are completely real. This is a genuine marine research facility, and it's going to produce legitimate scientific research. The intelligence-gathering capability doesn't compromise that, it enhances it. How so? Because the better we understand the ocean environment, the better we can monitor what's happening in it. The sensors that track marine life movements also track submarine movements. The equipment that studies water temperature and currents also provides intelligence about naval operations. I thought about Admiral Chen's words about translation, about finding common ground between different worlds. Same data, different interpretations. Same data, different applications, Frank agreed. The marine biologists working here will be doing real research that advances human knowledge about ocean ecosystems. The intelligence analysts will be using that same research to protect American interests. Neither mission compromises the other, and if anyone inspects the facility, they'll find exactly what they expect to find: a marine research station doing marine research. The final test came 3 months after the station became operational. A Chinese naval vessel approached the facility and requested permission to board for inspection. It was exactly the scenario we'd been preparing for, the moment when our careful construction would either hold up to scrutiny or expose the entire operation. I was on site that day, officially serving as a cultural liaison for the research team. In reality, I was there to handle any diplomatic complications that might arise from the inspection. The Chinese delegation consisted of a naval officer, a customs official, and a marine biologist who was clearly there to verify that our research was legitimate. They spent 4 hours examining every aspect of the facility, checking equipment, reviewing research records, and interviewing staff members. They found exactly what we'd built them to find. The marine biology research was not only legitimate, it was groundbreaking. The team had discovered 3 new species of deep-sea organisms and collected data that was advancing understanding of climate change impacts on marine ecosystems. The facility's equipment was exactly what it appeared to be, its staff were exactly who they claimed to be, and its research was exactly what was documented in its official records. The Chinese delegation left satisfied that they'd inspected a civilian research facility engaged in civilian research activities. They never knew that the same data they'd reviewed was also being used to track Chinese submarine movements, monitor naval communications, and assess military activities across a 1,000-mile radius. How does it feel, Frank asked me that evening, to successfully translate something that big? We were standing on the station's observation deck, watching stars appear over the darkening ocean. The facility hummed quietly around us, its systems performing dual functions that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. Like everything I've been training for, I said. Every negotiation, every diplomatic crisis, every time I've had to find common ground between opposing parties, it all led to this. Building something that serves everyone's interests without anyone knowing it. Building something that works, I said. That serves its purpose without creating new conflicts. Frank nodded, looking out at the dark water that concealed so many secrets. Your mother would have been proud, you know. It was the first time he'd mentioned her in years. She died when I was 12, too young to understand the complexities of the work her husband and son would eventually do. She always said you were going to do something important, he continued. Something that mattered. I just never imagined it would involve me too. We make a good team, I said. Yeah, he agreed. We do. The South China Sea facility has been operational for 2 years now. It's produced scientific research that has been published in major journals, advanced understanding of marine ecosystems in ways that benefit everyone, and provided intelligence that has helped prevent 3 separate incidents that could have escalated into military conflicts. Most importantly, it's served as a model for a new kind of international cooperation, the kind where different parties can pursue their own interests while contributing to shared knowledge and mutual security. Frank returned to his garage in Queens after the construction was completed, but he's no longer just working on trucks. He consults on projects I can't discuss, solving engineering problems that officially don't exist. His tool cabinet now contains equipment that would look strange to most people, but familiar to anyone who's ever built something that needed to serve multiple purposes simultaneously. I went back to my apartment in Arlington, but my role has evolved too. I'm still the translator, but now I understand what that really means. I don't just translate between languages. I translate between realities, helping to build bridges between worlds that need to connect without acknowledging that connection. The code name doesn't seem funny anymore. To my father, to Admiral Chen, to the people who track the work we do in classified files and after-action reports, the translator represents something specific, the ability to find solutions that serve multiple purposes, to build understanding between parties who can't admit they are working together, to create possibilities that shouldn't exist but somehow do. Last month, Admiral Chen came to dinner at my father's house. We sat around the same kitchen table where he'd first mocked my code name, eating my grandmother's lasagna recipe and talking about things that weren't classified. You know what I realized? Frank said as we were cleaning up. All those years I spent making fun of architects and city planners, complaining about people who designed things without understanding how they worked, I was wrong about that. How so? Admiral Chen asked. Designing something requires a different kind of understanding than building it, he said. Danny taught me that. You have to understand not just how things work, but how they need to work together, how they need to serve multiple purposes simultaneously. Like translation, I said. Like translation, he agreed. Same thing, different words. Admiral Chen smiled. I think you both understand now why we chose those particular code names. Because they describe what we actually do, Frank said. Because they describe who you are, she corrected. People who can take complex, seemingly impossible requirements and figure out how to make them work. People who can build bridges between worlds that aren't supposed to connect. As I drove home that night, I thought about the conversation that had started everything. My father's laughter when he first heard my code name, his conviction that it represented something insignificant and bureaucratic. He'd been wrong, but he'd also been right. The translator was bureaucratic in the sense that it described a specific role within a complex organizational structure. But it wasn't insignificant. It was exactly the opposite. It represented the kind of work that happens in the spaces between official categories, the solutions that emerge when people figure out how to serve multiple purposes simultaneously. I thought about the marine research station still operating in the South China Sea, still producing legitimate scientific research while serving intelligence functions that help maintain stability in one of the world's most volatile regions. I thought about all the similar projects that existed in the shadowy spaces between official acknowledgement and practical necessity. And I understood that this was what the translator really meant, not someone who converts words from one language to another, but someone who helps different worlds communicate without compromising their essential nature. Someone who builds bridges that work, even when no one can admit they exist. The last time my father and I had coffee in his kitchen, he asked me something that surprised me. Danny, do you think what we do makes a difference? I considered the question carefully. I think we solve problems that don't have obvious solutions. I think we build things that shouldn't be possible. I think we help people find common ground when everything suggests they should be enemies. But does it make a difference? I thought about the 3 military incidents that never happened because information gathered at our facility allowed diplomatic intervention. I thought about the scientific research that was advancing human understanding of climate change and marine ecosystems. I thought about the model of international cooperation that was being quietly studied and replicated in other regions. Yeah, Dad, I said. I think it makes a difference. He nodded, satisfied. Good, because if we're going to have strange code names and work on projects that officially don't exist, it better be for something important. It is, I said. It really is. The coffee had gone cold while we talked, but neither of us seemed to notice. Outside, the morning sun was filtering through those same yellowed curtains, casting everything in that familiar sepia tone that made our conversations feel like old photographs. But this time, I wasn't looking at the past. I was looking at the future we were helping to build, one impossible project at a time. My father was right about one thing: times do change. But he was wrong about what that meant. Times change not because old ways become obsolete, but because new challenges require old skills to be applied in new ways. The ability to build things that last, to create solutions that serve multiple purposes, to find common ground between opposing forces. These capabilities become more important as the world becomes more complex, not less. The translator might not sound like a warrior's code name, but it represents a different kind of strength. The strength to build understanding instead of walls. The strength to create possibilities instead of limitations. The strength to find solutions that work for everyone, even when no one can admit they are working together. That's what my father and I learned to do together. Translate impossible requirements into possible solutions. Build bridges between worlds that weren't supposed to connect. Create something that served everyone's interests without anyone having to acknowledge what it really was. It's the most important work either of us has ever done. And it all started with a code name that made him laugh. 6 months after that conversation, I found myself standing in another secure facility, this time in Singapore, watching Frank explain to a room full of international engineers how to build something that had never been built before. The South China Sea project had been such a success that it had spawned 3 follow-up initiatives, each more complex than the last. The key, Frank was saying, gesturing to a holographic display that showed a cross-section of what appeared to be a floating city, is understanding that every system has to serve multiple functions simultaneously. Nothing can be single-purpose when you're operating in contested waters. The engineers from Japan, South Korea, Australia, and the Philippines were listening with the kind of intense focus that came from understanding that they were being asked to solve problems that could reshape the balance of power in the Pacific. I watched my father work the room, translating not just between languages but between different engineering philosophies, different cultural approaches to problem-solving, different ways of thinking about what was possible. He'd become, in his own way, as much of a translator as I was. The living modules need to look like standard marine research habitats, he continued, but they also need to house communication equipment that can coordinate with satellite networks across 3 different national command structures. A Japanese engineer raised his hand. The weight distribution for equipment of that density would compromise the platform's stability in severe weather. Not if we use distributed architecture, Frank replied, switching to a different schematic. Instead of concentrating the heavy equipment in one location, we spread it throughout the structure, using the mass to actually improve stability rather than compromise it. This was the Frank Riley I'd never known existed, not just a construction worker who could build things that lasted, but a systems architect who could envision solutions that served multiple purposes without compromising any of them. The Singapore project was different from the South China Sea facility in almost every way. Where the first installation had been designed to look like a simple research station, this one was being built to appear as a floating commercial complex, part hotel, part conference center, part marine tourism facility. It would host legitimate business conferences, offer luxury accommodations to wealthy tourists, and provide a platform for marine research and conservation activities. It would also serve as a coordination hub for intelligence activities across Southeast Asia, a secure communication relay for military operations throughout the region, and a staging area for rapid response to maritime emergencies or security threats. How do you hide a military command center inside a luxury hotel? Dr. Kim had asked during the initial planning sessions. You don't hide it, I'd replied. You build a luxury hotel that happens to have a military command center integrated into its structure so seamlessly that they enhance each other instead of compromising each other. Translation, Frank had said, smiling. Same concept, different application. The construction process was even more complex than the South China Sea project. Instead of 3 countries, we were coordinating with 5. Instead of one cover story, we were maintaining 4 different public narratives depending on which government agency was asking questions. Instead of a single dual-purpose facility, we were building an entire complex that served dozens of different functions simultaneously. My role had evolved too. I wasn't just coordinating between different parties. I was essentially serving as a cultural ambassador for an operation that involved more international cooperation than most official diplomatic initiatives. Every day brought new challenges that required me to navigate between different legal systems, different security protocols, different ways of understanding what we were actually building. The thing about translation, Admiral Chen had told me during one of our monthly briefings, is that it's not just about converting information from one format to another. It's about preserving meaning while adapting to different contexts. That's what we're doing with these projects. That's what you've been doing your entire career, she'd replied. The South China Sea facility wasn't your first translation project. It was just the first one where you understood what you were actually translating. She was right. Looking back at my previous assignments, I could see the pattern that had been developing for years. Every diplomatic crisis I'd helped resolve, every international negotiation I'd facilitated, every cultural misunderstanding I'd helped bridge, they'd all been practice for the kind of complex, multi-layered translation work that these construction projects required. The difference was scale and permanence. Instead of translating between people who would meet for a few days and then return to their separate worlds, I was helping to build physical infrastructure that would maintain those translated relationships for decades. It's like building a language, Frank had said one evening as we reviewed the Singapore project's architectural plans. Not just vocabulary and grammar, but the underlying structure that allows different ideas to connect and create new meanings. Except instead of words, we're using steel and concrete and satellite arrays. And instead of sentences, we're building systems that can carry multiple messages simultaneously. The Singapore facility took 18 months to complete, and by the time it opened, it had already exceeded our most optimistic projections for success. The hotel was booked solid for its first year of operation, with guests praising its innovative design and state-of-the-art amenities. The conference center was hosting international business meetings that were generating millions of dollars in legitimate economic activity. The marine research component was producing scientific papers that were being cited in journals around the world. And the intelligence functions were providing information that had already prevented 2 potential conflicts and helped resolve 3 ongoing territorial disputes through diplomatic rather than military means. You know what I think the real innovation is? Frank asked me during the facility's official opening ceremony. We were standing on the observation deck of what appeared to be a luxury hotel suite but was actually one of the most sophisticated intelligence-gathering platforms ever built. What's that? We figured out how to make different purposes strengthen each other instead of competing with each other. He gestured toward the crowd of international guests mingling below us, business leaders, government officials, scientists, and tourists who had no idea they were participating in one of the most successful intelligence operations in modern history. The hotel works better because it has access to the intelligence network's communication systems. The intelligence operation works better because it's embedded in a legitimate business that gives it perfect cover and unlimited access to information. The research component works better because it has access to both commercial funding and classified resources. I watched a group of marine biologists explaining their latest discoveries to a group of business executives who were considering investing in ocean conservation initiatives. Neither group knew that the same data they were discussing was also being used to track submarine movements and monitor maritime shipping patterns. Symbiosis, I said. Exactly. Instead of building something that pretends to be something else, we built something that actually is multiple things at the same time. The success of the Singapore facility led to requests for similar projects from other regions. Within 2 years, Frank and I were traveling constantly, consulting on construction projects that pushed the boundaries of what was possible in terms of multipurpose infrastructure. We built a marine research vessel that served as a floating laboratory, a luxury cruise ship, and a mobile intelligence platform. We designed underwater habitats that functioned as research stations, tourist attractions, and strategic monitoring posts. We created port facilities that handled commercial shipping, scientific expeditions, and military operations with equal efficiency. Each project taught us something new about the art of translation, not just between languages or cultures, but between different ways of understanding reality itself. The thing about building bridges between worlds, Frank told a group of engineering students during a guest lecture at MIT, is that you have to understand that those worlds aren't just different, they are differently structured. They operate according to different rules, different assumptions about what's possible and what's necessary. The The students were listening with the kind of attention that suggested they were beginning to understand that engineering wasn't just about technical problem solving, but about cultural navigation. When you're designing something that needs to function in multiple worlds simultaneously, he continued, you can't just focus on making the technical specifications work. You have to understand how each world defines success, what each world considers acceptable risk, what each world needs to maintain its essential character. A student raised her hand. How do you reconcile conflicts between those different definitions? Frank smiled and looked at me. You find a translator, someone who can help you understand that apparent conflicts often aren't really contradictions. They are just different ways of describing the same underlying reality. Like what? Like the difference between a hotel and a command center, I said. They seem like completely different things until you understand that they are both systems for coordinating the activities of large numbers of people in complex environments. Once you see that similarity, you can design something that serves both functions without compromising either one. But how do you know when you've got it right? Another student asked. When everyone involved gets more than they expected, Frank replied. When the hotel guests have a better experience because of the advanced communication systems, when the intelligence analysts get better information because of the legitimate business relationships, when the researchers make discoveries they couldn't have made without access to both commercial and classified resources. After the lecture, Frank and I walked across the MIT campus, talking about the projects we'd completed and the ones we were planning. It was a crisp autumn day, the kind of weather that made everything seem possible. Do you ever miss the old work? I asked him, just building things that were clearly one thing and nothing else. He was quiet for a moment, considering the question. Sometimes, he said finally, there was something satisfying about the simplicity of it. You had a clear objective, clear specifications, clear metrics for success. But it wasn't really that simple, was it? Even when I was just building bridges or buildings or bases, I was always thinking about how they needed to fit into larger systems, how they needed to serve purposes beyond their immediate function. We passed a group of students working on what looked like a robotics project, their heads bent over components and schematics in a way that reminded me of our own planning sessions. I think what we do now is just a more honest version of what engineering has always been, Frank continued. Creating solutions that serve multiple stakeholders, building systems that need to function in complex environments, designing things that will be used in ways you can't entirely predict. Translation again. Everything is translation when you're working at the intersection of different worlds. That conversation took place 3 years ago. Since then, the scope of our work has expanded beyond anything I could have imagined when Admiral Chen first knocked on my apartment door. We're not just building individual facilities anymore, we're designing entire networks of interconnected systems that span continents and serve dozens of different purposes simultaneously. The latest project is the most ambitious yet, a series of floating platforms that will stretch across the Pacific, ostensibly serving as marine research stations, shipping waypoints, and emergency response bases. In reality, they'll constitute the backbone of a communication and monitoring network that will transform how intelligence is gathered and shared across the entire Pacific Rim. It's like building the internet, Frank explained to a classified briefing room full of military and intelligence officials from 8 different countries. But instead of connecting computers, we're connecting regions, interests, and capabilities in ways that strengthen all of them simultaneously. The briefing room was silent as the implications sank in. We weren't just talking about construction anymore, we were talking about fundamentally changing how international cooperation worked in the 21st century. The traditional model of intelligence sharing, I added, requires formal agreements between governments, official acknowledgments of cooperation, explicit protocols for information exchange. This approach allows countries to benefit from shared intelligence without having to officially acknowledge that they are cooperating. How? Asked a Japanese admiral whose name I wasn't cleared to know. Because they are not cooperating in intelligence sharing, Frank replied. They are cooperating in marine research, shipping efficiency, and emergency response. The intelligence sharing happens as a natural byproduct of those legitimate activities. Like translation, I said. Same information, different context. The Pacific Network Project, as it came to be known in classified documents, represents the culmination of everything Frank and I have learned about building bridges between worlds that aren't supposed to connect. It's also the most complex translation challenge either of us has ever faced. Instead of coordinating between 3 or 4 countries, we're working with 12. Instead of maintaining 1 or 2 cover stories, we're managing an ecosystem of interconnected narratives that need to be consistent across multiple cultures, legal systems, and political contexts. Instead of building a single multipurpose facility, we're creating a network of installations that will collectively serve hundreds of different functions while appearing to be nothing more than an ambitious international marine research initiative. The thing about networks, Frank told me as we stood on the deck of the construction vessel that was serving as our mobile headquarters, is that they are more than the sum of their parts. Each individual node might serve 2 or 3 purposes, but when you connect them all together, they create possibilities that didn't exist before. We were anchored at the site of what would become the central hub of the Pacific Network, a facility that would officially be known as the International Center for Marine Climate Research. It would host scientists from around the world, coordinate research expeditions across the Pacific, and serve as a model for international scientific cooperation. It would also serve as the command and control center for intelligence operations spanning from Alaska to Australia, coordinate military responses to threats across the entire Pacific Basin, and function as a secure communication relay for operations that officially didn't exist. How many people know what we're really building? I asked. Depends how you define really building, Frank replied. The marine researchers think we're building the most advanced oceanographic research network ever created. The intelligence analysts think we're building the most sophisticated monitoring system in military history. The emergency response coordinators think we're building a humanitarian aid network that could save thousands of lives during natural disasters. And they are all right. They are all right. That's what makes it work. The construction phase of the Pacific Network took 4 years and involved more international cooperation than most official treaties. By the time the last platform was operational, we had created something that was genuinely unprecedented, a system that served civilian, scientific, commercial, and military purposes simultaneously without any of those functions compromising the others. The marine research being conducted through the network has revolutionized understanding of climate change, ocean ecosystems, and marine biodiversity. The emergency response capabilities have already saved hundreds of lives during typhoons, tsunamis, and other natural disasters. The shipping coordination systems have improved maritime safety and efficiency throughout the Pacific, and the intelligence and security functions have helped prevent conflicts, facilitate diplomatic solutions to territorial disputes, and maintain stability in one of the world's most strategically important regions. You know what I think we really built? Frank asked me during the network's 5th anniversary celebration. We were standing on the observation deck of the central hub, watching sunrise paint the Pacific in shades of gold and orange. What's that? A new way of thinking about what international cooperation can look like. He gestured toward the horizon, where 3 other platforms were visible in the distance, each one serving multiple purposes for multiple stakeholders. For 70 years, international security has been based on the idea that countries need to choose sides, that cooperation requires formal agreements and official acknowledgments. And now we've proven that countries can work together without having to admit they are working together. They can share resources and information and capabilities without having to navigate all the political complexities that formal cooperation usually requires. I thought about all the diplomatic crises that had been quietly resolved through the network's communication channels, all the potential conflicts that had been prevented through early warning systems that officially didn't exist, all the scientific discoveries that had emerged from research that was simultaneously serving multiple purposes. We translated cooperation into a language that everyone could understand, I said. We made it possible for countries to cooperate without having to change their fundamental political positions. Frank agreed. Same interests, different vocabularies. And it all started with a marine research station that wasn't just a marine research station. It all started with understanding that things can be more than one thing at the same time without being less than any of those things individually. The Pacific Network has been operational for 7 years now, and it continues to evolve and expand. New platforms are added regularly, new capabilities are integrated seamlessly into existing systems, and new forms of cooperation emerge from the connections we've built. Frank and I no longer travel constantly for construction projects. Instead, we spend most of our time training other teams to apply the principles we've developed to projects around the world. The approach we pioneered in the South China Sea has been adapted for facilities in the Arctic, the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, and the Caribbean. The thing about translation, I told a group of engineering and intelligence professionals during a recent training session, is that once you understand the underlying principles, you can apply them anywhere. The specific techniques might change depending on the context, but the basic approach, finding ways to solve multiple purposes simultaneously without compromising any of them, that's universal. But how do you know when you're on the right track? One of the participants asked. When the people you're working with start saying things like, "We never thought of it that way before," or "That's exactly what we needed but we didn't know how to ask for it," Frank replied. When you find solutions that give everyone more than they thought was possible. When translation becomes creation, I added. When you're not just converting between existing realities, but building new realities that incorporate the best aspects of all the old ones. Last month, Admiral Chen came to dinner at Frank's house again. We sat around the same kitchen table where he'd first marked my code name, eating the same lasagna recipe, but talking about things that would have been unimaginable 8 years ago. "Do you know what the most successful aspect of the Pacific Network has been?" she asked. "The intelligence capabilities." Frank guessed. "The marine research," I said. "Both of those have exceeded expectations," Admiral Chen agreed. "But the most successful aspect has been the model itself. The proof that you can build systems that serve multiple purposes without compromising any of them." She pulled out a tablet and showed us a map of the world marked with dozens of locations where similar projects were under development. Facilities in the Arctic that serve as climate research stations, shipping waypoints, and strategic monitoring posts. Platforms in the Mediterranean that function as marine archaeology centers, refugee assistance hubs, and intelligence gathering stations. Networks in the Indian Ocean that coordinate scientific research, disaster response, and maritime security. "How many?" Frank asked. 43 operational facilities, 18 under construction, 37 in the planning stages. Admiral Chen smiled. "You've created an entirely new approach to international infrastructure development. We just figured out how to make translation into a construction technique," I said. "You figured out how to make cooperation possible without requiring agreement," she corrected. "You built bridges between worlds that can't officially acknowledge each other, but need to work together anyway." As I drove home that night, I thought about the conversation that had started everything. My father's laughter when he first heard my code name, his conviction that it represented something insignificant and bureaucratic. He'd been wrong about the significance, but he'd been right about the bureaucratic aspect. What we'd learned to do was essentially bureaucratic, creating systems and procedures that allowed different organizations, different countries, different ways of understanding the world to work together effectively. But it was bureaucracy as a creative act, as a form of translation that built new possibilities instead of just managing existing ones. I thought about the marine research station still operating in the South China Sea, now the oldest node in a network that spanned the Pacific and was serving as a model for similar networks around the world. I thought about all the scientific discoveries that had emerged from research that was simultaneously serving intelligence and security functions. I thought about all the conflicts that had been prevented through early warning systems that officially didn't exist. And I understood that this was what the translator had always meant, not someone who converts words from one language to another, but someone who helps different worlds find ways to communicate and cooperate without losing their essential character. Someone who builds bridges that work, even when no one can officially admit they exist. Someone who creates new possibilities by helping existing realities recognize their common ground. The work continues. Every month brings new challenges, new opportunities to apply the principles we've developed to different contexts and different problems. The specific techniques continue to evolve, but the underlying approach remains the same. Find ways to serve multiple purposes simultaneously, build systems that strengthen each other instead of competing with each other, create bridges between worlds that need to connect but can't officially acknowledge that connection. Frank is 73 now, officially retired but still consulting on projects that push the boundaries of what's possible in multipurpose infrastructure. His garage in Queens has become an informal research and development center filled with prototypes and models for systems that serve multiple functions simultaneously. "You know what I've learned after all these years?" he asked me during our most recent conversation. "What's that?" "Everything is translation work if you understand it correctly. Building a bridge isn't just about connecting two pieces of land. It's about translating the idea of connection into physical reality. Designing a building isn't just about creating shelter. It's about translating human needs into architectural form." I thought about that as I watched him work on his latest project, a scale model of a floating platform that could serve as a research station, emergency shelter, and communication relay simultaneously. "So what makes our work different?" "We're just more honest about it," he said, adjusting a component that would serve 3 different functions depending on how it was configured. "We acknowledge that translation is what we're doing, instead of pretending that we're building single-purpose systems in a multipurpose world. And that makes it better. It makes it more effective. When you understand that you're translating between different needs and different possibilities, you can design solutions that serve all of them instead of forcing people to choose." The latest project we're consulting on is the most ambitious yet, a global network of facilities that will coordinate climate research, disaster response, and international security across all the world's oceans. It will take decades to complete and will require unprecedented levels of international cooperation. It will also represent the ultimate application of everything we've learned about translation as a construction technique, building systems that serve everyone's interests without requiring anyone to officially acknowledge that they are cooperating. "Think it will work?" Frank asked me as we reviewed the preliminary plans. "I think it's the future," I said. "I think this is how international cooperation is going to work in the 21st century, through shared infrastructure that serves multiple purposes simultaneously. Translation as diplomacy. Translation as architecture. Building bridges between worlds instead of just talking about them." Frank smiled and returned to his work on the scale model. "Your mother really would have been proud," he said quietly. "I think she would have understood what we're doing," I replied. "She always said the most important conversations happen between people who speak different languages but find ways to understand each other anyway. Same meaning, different words. Same goals, different approaches. Same needs, different expressions. Same world, different ways of seeing it." We worked in comfortable silence for a while. 2 translators building bridges between realities that needed to connect but couldn't officially acknowledge that connection. The phone rang again 3 months later, just as Frank and I were finishing breakfast in his kitchen. The same kitchen where this all began, with the same yellow curtains and the same creaking chair, but everything else had changed in ways that neither of us could have imagined when Admiral Chen first knocked on my apartment door. "Arctic Crisis Level 2. Admiral Chen's voice was calm but urgent. "The Russians have discovered something under the ice that changes everything." Frank and I exchanged looks. We'd just returned from overseeing the completion of the 3rd Pacific Network expansion, and our next scheduled project wasn't supposed to begin for another 6 months. "What kind of something?" I asked. "Biological. Potentially revolutionary. Definitely classified above anything we've discussed before." There was a pause. "Gentlemen, we may have found evidence of non-terrestrial life preserved in Arctic ice formations." The coffee cup slipped from Frank's hand, shattering on the linoleum floor. Neither of us moved to clean it up. "Are you saying?" I'm saying we need to build a facility that can house the most important scientific discovery in human history while maintaining absolute secrecy and serving the interests of multiple nations who absolutely cannot be allowed to fight a war over extraterrestrial biological samples. Frank looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, part terror, part excitement, part recognition that we'd just been asked to translate between humanity and the universe itself. When do we leave? I asked. Yesterday, Admiral Chen replied. This is beyond top secret. This is species-level classification. And if we get it wrong, it could mean the difference between peaceful contact with extraterrestrial intelligence and a global war that destroys human civilization. 2 hours later, we were on another military transport, heading toward what would become the most important translation project in human history. The briefing materials were unlike anything either of us had seen. Biological analyses that suggested organized structures within ice samples, molecular patterns that didn't match any known terrestrial organisms, and preliminary assessments that indicated the samples were not only of extraterrestrial origin, but might still contain viable biological information. The challenge, explained Dr. Elizabeth Reeves, our new lead scientist and apparently the only person on Earth with expertise in both astrobiology and international crisis management, is that everyone wants exclusive access to the samples, but no one can be allowed to have it. These specimens could revolutionize our understanding of life itself, could provide technologies that transform human civilization, could answer the fundamental question of whether we're alone in the universe. And every major power is willing to fight a war to control them, Frank said. Exactly. Russia found them in territory they claim as their own. The United States insists the discovery was made using American satellite technology. China argues that any extraterrestrial biological material belongs to all of humanity. The European Union maintains that proper scientific study requires international oversight. I felt that familiar sense of impossible possibilities, but magnified beyond anything we'd experienced before. So we need to build a facility that gives everyone access to the most important discovery in human history without giving anyone control over it, while ensuring that the biological samples remain viable, that all research is conducted safely, and that the discovery remains completely secret until humanity is ready to process the implications, Dr. Reeves added. In Arctic conditions that could destroy the samples if we get the environmental controls wrong, Frank concluded. No pressure. The design phase took place in a facility so classified that it didn't appear on any map, with security protocols that made our previous projects look like public works programs. Teams of scientists, engineers, and security specialists from a dozen countries worked together on systems that would need to preserve biological samples that might be millions of years old while facilitating research that could change the trajectory of human development. The biological containment systems alone are more complex than anything we've ever built, Frank explained during one of our planning sessions. We need isolation protocols that prevent contamination in either direction, research capabilities that allow detailed study without damaging the samples, and security measures that ensure no single nation can claim exclusive access. And we need to do it all while maintaining the cover story that we're building an advanced climate research station, I added. If word leaks that we've found extraterrestrial life, it could cause global panic before we understand what we're dealing with. Translation on the ultimate level, Dr. Reeves said quietly. We're not just bridging between human cultures, we're potentially bridging between human and non-human intelligence. The construction of what became known as the Arctic Astrobiology Research Station required innovations that pushed every aspect of our translation-based design philosophy to its absolute limits. We weren't just building a facility that served multiple human purposes. We were building humanity's first infrastructure for studying life that might have originated beyond our planet. The key insight, I explained to the International Oversight Committee during the final design review, is that this discovery belongs to all of humanity, but humanity isn't ready to handle it. Our job is to create a system that allows the best minds from around the world to study these samples while ensuring that the knowledge gained serves everyone's interests simultaneously. How do we prevent any single nation from claiming the discovery? Asked a representative whose name and country I wasn't cleared to know. We don't prevent it. We make it unnecessary, Frank replied. We design the research infrastructure so that the most important discoveries can only be made through international collaboration. No single nation has all the expertise needed to understand what we've found. Russian expertise in ice core preservation, American technology for biological analysis, Chinese capabilities in molecular modeling, European protocols for safe containment. Everyone needs everyone else to unlock the secrets we've discovered. Like building a language that can only be spoken by multiple voices simultaneously, I added. The research phase exceeded every expectation we'd dared to have. The biological samples weren't just evidence of extraterrestrial life. They were evidence of organized, complex structures that suggested intelligence. Not technological intelligence like humans possessed, but biological intelligence that had evolved along completely different lines. We're not just looking at alien life, Dr. Reeves explained during one of our monthly progress briefings. We're looking at alien approaches to consciousness, to organization, to survival strategies that we never imagined were possible. And everyone's learning simultaneously, Frank added, watching feeds from the research laboratories where teams from around the world were working together on discoveries that would reshape human understanding of life itself. No single nation gets exclusive access to the information, but everyone benefits from discoveries that none of them could have made alone. Translation between species, I said, building bridges between human and non-human ways of organizing reality. The Arctic Astrobiology Research Station became operational during the darkest part of the Arctic winter, when 24 hours of darkness provided natural cover for operations that needed to remain absolutely secret. Within the first year of operation, research conducted at the facility had revolutionized understanding of biological organization, suggested new approaches to medical treatment, and provided insights into consciousness that challenged fundamental assumptions about intelligence and awareness. Most importantly, the international cooperation protocols developed for studying extraterrestrial life became the foundation for humanity's first truly global scientific enterprise, research that served all of humanity simultaneously instead of advancing individual national interests. Do you understand what we've accomplished? Admiral Chen asked during the facility's second anniversary review. We were meeting in a location I couldn't identify, but the secure connections allowed us to see real-time feeds from research stations around the world and beyond Earth's atmosphere. We've created infrastructure for humanity's first contact with non-human intelligence, Frank said. We've proven that the most important discoveries can only be made through cooperation that transcends national boundaries, I added. You've done something more fundamental than that, Admiral Chen replied. You've prepared humanity for a universe that's larger and more complex than we ever imagined. When the time comes to reveal what we've found, when humanity is ready to understand that we're not alone, the infrastructure you've built will be the foundation for how our species interacts with forms of life we never dreamed were possible. Looking at the global network of facilities we'd helped create, research stations, communication platforms, resource coordination centers, and now humanity's first astrobiology laboratory, I realized that we'd built something unprecedented in human history. Not just individual projects that served multiple purposes, but an entire civilization infrastructure based on cooperation instead of competition, on shared benefit instead of exclusive advantage. What's next? Frank asked. Admiral Chen smiled. First contact protocols. Real ones. For when we're ready to announce what we've found, and for when we discover that the samples we've been studying are just the beginning. The future stretched ahead of us, full of possibilities that would have seemed like science fiction when this all began with a mocked code name in a kitchen in Queens. But now I understood that science fiction was just another form of translation, taking realities that didn't exist yet and making them comprehensible to minds that weren't ready for them. Frank and I continued our walk, building bridges between worlds and realities and forms of consciousness that needed to connect but couldn't officially acknowledge their connection. The techniques evolved, the projects became more complex, but the fundamental approach remained the same. Find common ground, serve multiple purposes simultaneously, create systems that make cooperation more beneficial than competition. Years passed, decades passed. The network of facilities we'd helped create spread across the world and beyond, each one serving multiple purposes for multiple stakeholders, each one proving that translation-based infrastructure was the key to solving humanity's most complex challenges. Climate change, resource scarcity, international conflicts, space exploration, and now the study of extraterrestrial life, all of them responded to the same fundamental approach: find ways to serve everyone's essential interests simultaneously instead of forcing people to choose between cooperation and competition. Frank lived to see the completion of projects that spanned the solar system, facilities on Mars and Europa and in the asteroid belt that served scientific, commercial, and security purposes simultaneously. He died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 94, in the same house in Queens where he'd first marked my code name, surrounded by scale models of structures that had changed the course of human civilization. I continued the work for another 20 years, training new generations of translators who would build bridges between realities that hadn't been imagined yet. The principles remained the same, but the applications grew more complex and more wonderful with each passing year. The last project I worked on before my own retirement was the most ambitious yet, a communication facility designed to enable real-time translation between human consciousness and the biological intelligence we'd discovered in the Arctic ice. Not just studying alien life, but actually communicating with it, learning from it, finding common ground between forms of consciousness that had evolved on different worlds under different conditions. It was the ultimate translation challenge, building bridges not just between human cultures or human and extraterrestrial life, but between entirely different ways of experiencing reality itself. And it worked. The day we achieved our first successful communication exchange with extraterrestrial intelligence, I stood in the same observation deck where Frank and I had watched sunrise over the Pacific Network's central hub. But now I was watching something far more extraordinary: humanity's first conversation with minds that had evolved beyond Earth, facilitated by infrastructure we'd built to serve everyone's interests simultaneously. The extraterrestrial intelligence wasn't hostile or threatening. It was curious, ancient, and profoundly different from human consciousness. But it was also intelligent, aware, and interested in the same questions that had driven human development for millennia. How do different forms of life find ways to understand each other? How do diverse realities connect and strengthen each other? How do we build systems that serve everyone's essential needs while respecting everyone's essential differences? In other words, how do we translate between worlds that need to connect but don't know how to acknowledge their connection? The conversations between human and extraterrestrial intelligence became the foundation for a new phase of human development, one based not on conquest or competition, but on translation and cooperation with forms of life we'd never imagined were possible. Frank would have loved it. I retired on a Tuesday in March, exactly 50 years after my father had first marked my code name in his kitchen in Queens. The world I left behind was unrecognizable from the one where that conversation had taken place. A global civilization based on cooperation instead of competition, connected by infrastructure that served everyone's interests simultaneously, engaged in active communication with extraterrestrial intelligence that had expanded human understanding of consciousness itself. But the fundamental work remained the same: building bridges between realities that needed to connect, finding common ground between different ways of understanding the world, creating systems that made cooperation more beneficial than competition. Translation work. The most important work anyone has ever done. Now, as I write these words in my own retirement, living in the same house in Queens where Frank once marked my code name, I can look out the window and see the world we helped create. The sky is filled with aircraft that navigate using communication systems we designed to serve multiple purposes simultaneously. The harbor is busy with ships that follow routing protocols we developed to coordinate commercial, scientific, and security operations without compromising any of them. The city itself is connected by infrastructure that was built using principles we pioneered, systems that serve everyone's needs by acknowledging that everyone's needs are fundamentally connected. Young people today take it for granted that international cooperation is the default approach to solving complex problems. They assume that research facilities serve multiple purposes simultaneously, that resources are shared rather than hoarded, that different nations work together because cooperation produces better results than competition. They don't know that this wasn't always the case, that there was a time when countries prepared for war over resources instead of building shared infrastructure to access them. They don't know that it all started with a code name that made my father laugh. But I know, and in the files I'm leaving behind, the records of every project Frank and I worked on, every translation challenge we solved, every bridge we built between worlds that weren't supposed to connect, future generations will find the blueprints for continuing the work we started. Because the work never truly ends. There are always new realities that need to connect, new forms of consciousness that need to find common ground, new possibilities that can only emerge when different worlds acknowledge their shared interests without compromising their essential differences. The phone still rings sometimes. Not Admiral Chen. She retired years ago to write memoirs that will never be declassified, but her successors, young officers who understand that the most important military installations are often the ones that don't look like military installations at all. They call when there are new challenges that require translation, new projects that need someone who understands how to build bridges between worlds that can't officially acknowledge their connection. I tell them what Frank would have told them. Find the common ground. Serve multiple purposes simultaneously. Build systems that make cooperation more beneficial than competition. And remember that the most important work is often the work that doesn't look important to people who don't understand what translation really means. The code name the translator has been retired now, replaced by new designations for new specialists working on challenges that Frank and I never imagined. But the principles remain the same, and the work continues. In my garage, the same garage where Frank once worked on his truck and built scale models of impossible structures, I keep my own collection of prototypes and plans, models of facilities that might be built on distant worlds, systems that could enable communication between forms of consciousness we haven't discovered yet, infrastructure that could support human expansion into regions of space where cooperation isn't just beneficial but essential for survival. Sometimes neighborhood kids wander in and ask what I'm building. I tell them I'm working on translation projects, systems that help different realities understand each other. They nod politely and go back to their games, not understanding that they are living in a world where such translation is possible because someone figured out how to build bridges between impossible realities. But someday, when they are older and faced with challenges that seem impossible to solve, they might remember the old man in the garage who talked about building bridges between worlds. They might understand that the most important work often looks like ordinary engineering or routine diplomacy or simple conversation, but is actually about finding ways to connect realities that need each other but don't know how to admit it. They might even understand that everything is translation work if you approach it correctly. The house is quieter now than it was when Frank was alive, but it's not empty. The walls are filled with memories of conversations about impossible projects and successful translations and the satisfaction that comes from building something that serves everyone's interests simultaneously. The kitchen table where he first marked my code name is now covered with papers and plans for projects that won't be completed for decades, infrastructure that will serve purposes we can't entirely predict for people who haven't been born yet. But that's how translation work always is. Building bridges to destinations you can't see clearly, creating connections between realities that don't know they need each other yet, preparing infrastructure for conversations that haven't started but will be essential when they do. Last week, I received a package with no return address, the kind of delivery that meant official business conducted through unofficial channels. Inside was a tablet containing files marked with classification levels that hadn't existed when Frank and I started our work. The message was simple: for the architect of impossible possibilities, one final translation challenge. The files described a situation that would have been pure science fiction when my father first marked my code name, but now seemed like a natural evolution of everything we'd built. Humanity's communication network with extraterrestrial intelligence had detected signals from multiple sources, not just the biological consciousness we'd discovered in Arctic ice, but technological civilizations from distant star systems, each with their own approaches to communication, cooperation, and the fundamental questions that drive intelligent life. The challenge was familiar even if the scale was unprecedented. How do you build infrastructure that allows multiple forms of intelligence, human, biological extraterrestrial, and technological alien, to communicate and cooperate without any single form of consciousness dominating the others? How do you create systems that serve everyone's essential interests while respecting differences so fundamental that they challenge the basic assumptions about what intelligence means? How do you translate between realities that evolved under different suns in different dimensions of space and time, with different approaches to existence itself? I studied the files for hours, feeling that familiar combination of excitement and impossibility that had driven every project Frank and I had undertaken. This wasn't just building a facility or coordinating international cooperation. This was designing infrastructure for a community of consciousness that spanned multiple worlds, multiple forms of life, multiple ways of experiencing reality. It was the ultimate translation challenge. I picked up the phone and called the number that had been included with the files. A voice I didn't recognize answered, but the tone was familiar, young, professional, and carrying the weight of responsibilities that officially didn't exist. "Mr. Riley, this is Commander Martinez. I understand you received our materials." "I did," I said. "This is quite a challenge you're describing." "Yes, sir. We're calling it the Galactic Translation Project. The infrastructure you and your father developed for terrestrial cooperation has proven that different forms of consciousness can work together when properly facilitated. But this..." She paused. "This would be humanity's first attempt to join a community of intelligence that spans multiple star systems." I looked around Frank's old garage, at the scale models and prototypes that represented decades of learning how to build bridges between impossible realities. "What's the timeline?" "The alien civilizations are patient, but they are also curious. They want to understand how human consciousness works, how our approach to cooperation and translation might contribute to their own community. We have perhaps 2 years to design and build a communication facility that could serve as humanity's embassy to a galactic community of intelligence. And if we succeed, we become part of something larger than our species has ever imagined. If we fail, we remain isolated in a universe full of consciousness we can't communicate with," I finished. "Exactly." I was quiet for a moment, considering the implications. Frank would have been fascinated by the engineering challenges, building communication systems that could function across interstellar distances, designing protocols that could bridge between radically different forms of consciousness, creating infrastructure that served multiple types of intelligence simultaneously. "Commander Martinez," I said finally, "I'm 85 years old. I haven't worked on an active project in over a decade. So, with respect, you're the only person on Earth who understands how to build bridges between realities that aren't supposed to connect. Your entire career has been preparation for exactly this challenge." She was right, and we both knew it. Every diplomatic crisis I'd helped resolve, every facility Frank and I had built, every time we'd found common ground between competing interests, it had all been practice for this moment. The moment when humanity would need to prove that our approach to translation and cooperation could work on a galactic scale. Who would I be working with? Teams from every space-capable nation, plus some that aren't officially space-capable yet. Scientists who specialize in consciousness research, engineers who understand interstellar communication, linguists who study forms of language that don't depend on sound or symbols. Plus, she paused, the biological extraterrestrial intelligence we've been communicating with. They've volunteered to serve as intermediaries between human consciousness and the other galactic civilizations. I smiled, thinking about Frank's approach to impossible projects. "When do I start? How soon can you get to Houston?" 3 hours later, I was on a plane for the first time in 5 years, heading toward what would become the most important translation project in human history. The team assembled for the Galactic Translation Project included some of the most brilliant minds on Earth, plus consciousness researchers who had been studying the biological extraterrestrial intelligence, plus artificial intelligence systems that had been designed specifically to facilitate communication between radically different forms of consciousness. "The challenge," explained Dr. Sarah Kim, who had been my colleague on the Lunar project and was now leading humanity's first galactic communication initiative, is that we're not just translating between different languages or different cultures. We're translating between different approaches to reality itself. She showed me preliminary communication logs from the various alien civilizations that had made contact. One species communicated through patterns of quantum entanglement that spanned light years. Another shared consciousness through biological networks that encompassed entire planets. A third existed primarily as energy patterns that moved between star systems, experiencing time and space in ways that human consciousness couldn't directly comprehend. And they all want to understand how human consciousness works. I asked. Specifically, they want to understand our approach to cooperation and translation, Dr. Kim replied. Most galactic civilizations develop either pure competition, where different groups fight for resources until one dominates, or pure cooperation, where individual consciousness merges into collective intelligence. Humans are apparently unique in developing systems that serve individual and collective interests simultaneously. Translation-based cooperation, I said. Exactly. The ability to maintain distinct identities while working together toward shared goals. The alien civilizations are fascinated by this approach and want to learn how to apply it to their own relationships with each other. The design phase took place in facilities that made our previous classified projects look like public works programs. Teams of consciousness researchers worked alongside interstellar communication specialists and quantum entanglement engineers to create systems that would need to facilitate communication between forms of intelligence that experienced reality in fundamentally different ways. The key insight, I explained to the International Project Committee during the final design review, is that consciousness itself is a universal language. Different civilizations might experience reality differently, but they all share the fundamental challenges of existence. How do you understand yourself? How do you relate to others? How do you build systems that serve everyone's essential needs without compromising anyone's essential nature? But how do we design communication protocols for consciousness that doesn't experience time linearly, or space three-dimensionally, or causation in ways that humans can understand? Asked a representative from the European Space Agency. We don't design protocols, I replied. We design infrastructure that allows each form of consciousness to communicate in its own natural way, while providing translation layers that help all the different approaches connect and strengthen each other. Like building a universal translator for reality itself, said Dr. Kim. Like building a common ground that different forms of consciousness can share without having to abandon their essential nature, I corrected. The construction of the Galactic Communication Facility required technologies that pushed every boundary of human knowledge and capabilities. Quantum communication arrays that could maintain coherent signals across interstellar distances. Consciousness interface systems that could translate between biological, artificial, and energy-based forms of intelligence. Temporal coordination protocols that allowed communication between civilizations that experienced time at different rates. Most importantly, it required the same fundamental approach that Frank and I had developed for terrestrial projects, serving multiple purposes simultaneously, finding common ground between different approaches to the same challenges, building systems that made cooperation more beneficial than competition. The facility became operational on a Tuesday in October, exactly 60 years after my father had first mocked my code name in his kitchen in Queens. The first successful communication exchange with the galactic community of consciousness was unlike anything anyone had imagined, not words or images or mathematical equations, but a direct sharing of approaches to the fundamental questions that drove all forms of intelligent life. How do you understand yourself in relation to others? How do you build systems that serve everyone's essential needs? How do you create communities that strengthen individual consciousness while advancing collective capabilities? The alien civilizations were fascinated by humanity's answers to these questions, not because our answers were superior, but because they were different, and because those differences suggested new possibilities that none of the established galactic civilizations had considered. You know what this means? Dr. Kim asked as we watched the first successful multi-species consciousness sharing session through the facility's monitoring systems. What? It means the translation approach you and your father developed isn't just the key to human cooperation. It's the key to galactic civilization itself. I watched the displays showing consciousness patterns from multiple star systems connecting and strengthening each other through infrastructure we'd built to serve everyone's essential interests simultaneously. The same principles that had allowed competing nations to cooperate on terrestrial projects were now allowing different species to participate in a community of consciousness that spanned the galaxy. Frank would have loved this, I said. He did love it, Dr. Kim replied, showing me a message that had been transmitted through the consciousness sharing network. It wasn't in words or symbols, but in the direct communication of understanding itself, the recognition that the most important work is building bridges between realities that need to connect but don't know how to acknowledge their connection. The message came from the biological extraterrestrial intelligence we'd first discovered in Arctic ice, but it carried the unmistakable signature of consciousness that had been shaped by translation work, by the understanding that everything is connected if you know how to find the common ground. He's still working, I said quietly. We're all still working, Dr. Kim agreed. The work never ends. There are always new realities that need to connect, new forms of consciousness that need to find common ground, new bridges that need to be built between worlds that don't know they need each other yet. I returned to Queens with a head full of possibilities and a heart full of satisfaction. The Galactic Communication Facility was operational. Humanity had joined a community of consciousness that spanned multiple star systems. And the translation approach Frank and I had developed was being adapted for challenges we'd never imagined. But the most important realization was that the work would continue. New generations of translators would build bridges between realities that hadn't been discovered yet, would find common ground between forms of consciousness that hadn't evolved yet, would create infrastructure that served purposes no one could predict yet. The code name the translator had evolved into a galactic profession, a way of approaching reality that recognized that everything is connected, that different doesn't mean incompatible, that the most important work is often the work that builds bridges between worlds that need each other but don't know how to admit it. It's the most important work either of us has ever done, and it all started with a code name that made him laugh.